appear in Europe, from Hermetic philosophy to esoteric science and sacred geometry, the origins of which remain largely unexplained. Some scholars believe that the Templars or their allied networks quietly leaked portions of this knowledge obtained in the East and from ancient relics. But the core knowledge, the materials concerning prehistoric civilizations, architectural mastery, and metaphysical cosmology, is thought to have been locked away by the Vatican. These documents, if they exist and were made public, could fundamentally challenge the pillars of Western religious doctrine, which rests on a view of human history beginning with the biblical creation. One indirect piece of evidence is that for centuries, the Vatican has consistently refused requests to open its archives to independent scholars. Even faithful Catholic academics are granted access only to carefully curated sections. The deep archives, where materials from the Crusader campaigns may lie, remain strictly off-limits. So what did the Crusaders really bring back? We may never know for certain, but the remaining clues, from symbols in ancient Templar churches to forbidden emblems, suggest that beneath the visible crusades ran a profound current of hidden knowledge, far richer than the official histories reveal. And until the Vatican, or someone else, unlocks the great iron doors of these forbidden vaults, this question will continue to haunt all who yearn to understand the true history of humankind. In the vast canvas of human history, the rise and fall of civilizations is often portrayed as the inevitable result of natural forces, disasters, wars, plagues. These are the causes most often cited in official records. But there is another side to this story, a darker and far more unsettling side, seldom included in mainstream education, the tale of civilizations that were not destroyed by fate, but by the deliberate will of forces lurking in the shadows. The questions beg to be asked. Why? And who wielded the blade? To find the answers, we must look deeper, into cases where the collapse of once great cultures was not the random hand of misfortune, but the outcome of carefully orchestrated plans to erase knowledge, control history, and shape global power. One of the clearest examples is the destruction of the Cathar civilization in southern France during the 13th century. The Cathars, united with their simple philosophy of life, respect for spiritual freedom, and preservation of ancient religious and medical knowledge, were seen as a profound threat by the Roman Catholic Church. The Albigensian Crusade was not merely a religious war, it was a systematic campaign to obliterate an entire culture, to burn its sacred texts, to silence its teachers, and to eliminate alternative streams of thought. When the fortress of Montségur fell in 1244, not only were thousands of people burned alive, so too were countless precious manuscripts reduced to ash. Who orchestrated this? Clearly, the Vatican, driven not only by the defense of doctrine, but by the deeper aim of ensuring that no stream of knowledge outside its sanctioned control could take root. Another, even more subtle, example is the near-total erasure of indigenous knowledge in Central and South America following European conquest. The Maya, Inca, and Aztec civilizations possessed advanced systems of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture. Yet after the conquests, more than 99% of their written works were destroyed, burned by Franciscan and Jesuit priests in the name of purifying heresy. Why? Because this knowledge not only clashed with Christian worldviews, it threatened the monopoly of European scholars. To control knowledge is to control power, and in many cases, destroying an entire civilization was seen as the most efficient way to achieve this. Another profound example is the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. To this day, archaeologists remain unable to fully explain why this highly advanced urban culture vanished so completely. Unorthodox sources, including manuscripts from certain Western esoteric orders, suggest that external forces may have intervened, seeking to prevent the spread of Harappan metaphysical knowledge. Symbols found on Harappan pottery and architecture hint at an understanding of natural energies, sacred geometry, and acoustic resonance, knowledge that could have radically altered the consciousness of neighboring civilizations and even modern humanity had it survived. But who are the forces behind such schemes? Across history, a familiar pattern emerges: entities seeking to control knowledge in order to concentrate power, be they empires, religious institutions, or secretive organizations. In the Middle Ages, the Vatican was a prime actor. In more recent times, groups such as the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and international financial elites have been accused of manipulating information, sometimes suppressing archaeological discoveries that could challenge the official historical narrative. Part of this is to safeguard existing power structures. But a deeper reason may lie in an ancient fear that if humanity were to rediscover certain forgotten metaphysical truths, the balance of power between elites and the general populace could be irreversibly upended. Thus, civilizations destroyed by design are not merely the victims of war or imperial greed. They are casualties of a centuries-long war to control humanity's collective memory. And even today, the fragments that remain, hidden manuscripts, buried artifacts, distorted legends, still whisper stories not yet fully told. Stories of a history that perhaps we are still not permitted to fully know. There is a truth that many scholars privately acknowledge, yet few dare to discuss openly. Within humanity's vast body of knowledge there exist forbidden books. Not because they are baseless nor unscientific, but because they contain warnings too unsettling for the powers that be. When these warnings are peeled away, they reveal a chilling message: that history itself moves in inescapable cycles of rise and fall, light and shadow, wisdom and ignorance, repeating endlessly as though humanity is trapped within a hidden wheel few are conscious enough to perceive. And strikingly, in ancient forbidden texts, from Gnostic writings, Hermetic manuscripts, to the works of philosophers cast out from mainstream thought, these warnings were clearly written. A classic example appears in the Corpus Hermeticum, the collection of mystical writings from the Greco-Egyptian world. In the prophecy of Hermes we read, "There shall come a time when men will forget their divine origin. Only the outward appearances of knowledge shall be honored, while true wisdom is buried. Temples will be built without understanding of the divine. Science shall progress, yet lack wisdom, and the world will spiral toward destruction through its own arrogance." That warning echoes as though spoken for our own age. In the forbidden Gnostic texts, banned by the Church for millennia, there exists the concept of the archons, symbolic entities representing forces that manipulate human consciousness, causing humanity to forget its true nature and become trapped in the cycles of material history. According to these texts, when humans become too enthralled with technology, too fragmented in their understanding, and too obsessed with hollow wars of ideology, that is when the cycle resets. A brilliant civilization can collapse, not from lack of technology, but from losing the harmony between knowledge and spirit. Even within the Hermetic manuscripts, there are passages describing that prior civilizations, unnamed, had fallen into precisely this trap. They achieved remarkable technological mastery, yet created tools of destruction beyond their control. When the balance was broken, nature itself, described as a deeper intelligence, restored order through catastrophe. Are we now repeating that same history? Signs are everywhere. As artificial intelligence, bioweapons, and mind control technologies advance toward unprecedented heights, we also see a simultaneous erosion of human values, inner knowledge, and genuine human connection. Notably, certain forbidden texts of the Middle Ages warned that every period of extreme technological brilliance carries the risk of deep societal imbalance. When humankind believes it can replace the divine or nature with machines and pure logic, that is the moment when collapse begins silently. Another profound example lies within ancient alchemical writings. The alchemists were not merely seeking gold, they embedded deep philosophy about the life cycle of civilizations. According to their teachings, any civilization passes through the phases of nigredo, darkness, albedo, rebirth, and rubedo, completion. But when this natural process is forcibly halted, when power structures seek to freeze a civilization in the rubedo phase through control or violence, decay inevitably follows. In our modern world, with global networks of information control, cultural homogenization, and resource dominance on a scale never before seen, we are in danger of falling into exactly that trap. Modern forbidden literature, from studies on thought control technologies to reports on the risks of runaway AI, show that the cycle is closing faster than ever. Yet, like the Gnostic manuscripts of old, these warnings are kept on the fringes, excluded from mainstream discourse. Perhaps the bitterest truth is this: prior civilizations, Atlantis, if it truly existed, Sumer, ancient Egypt, the Maya, all seem to have followed these same paths. Their remaining ruins, inscriptions, and oral legends all whisper of golden ages lost, swept away by human arrogance and imbalance. Are we destined to repeat their fate? As the ancient Hermetic sages said, the answer depends entirely on whether we can learn the lesson. But to learn, we must be free to access the knowledge, including that which is now forbidden or distorted. And perhaps in this turbulent age, seeking out the warnings contained in forbidden books and listening to the wisdom of the past may be our last chance to break free from the harsh cycle that human history seems unable to escape. Perhaps the greatest danger is not when a civilization collapses, but when its memory is erased from our collective consciousness. For when memory is lost, so too are the lessons. And when the lessons are gone, the cycle of history is given the chance to begin once more. The stories we have explored together of buried civilizations, forbidden books burned, hidden knowledge sealed away, and warnings deliberately obscured, these are not mere fragments of some distant past. They stand as reminders that history, no matter how distorted or concealed, remains alive. It whispers through folk legends, through symbols etched into ancient stone walls, through manuscripts preserved in silent lineages. And above all, it lives in how we remember, how we retell, and how we act today. For each time someone asks, what lies beyond the official version of truth? That is a moment when a small part of history's hidden light is rekindled. Each time a person reads a forbidden text, explores a forgotten civilization, or sits quietly before an ancient ruin, not hurriedly snapping a photo for the internet, but truly listening to the stones, the winds, the echoes of memory. In that moment, the great wheel of ignorance slows, if only a little. But this is no easy task, for the forces that seek to control memory remain strong. They shape our education systems, dominate the media, and even influence the way we think about what history is meant to be. They would have us believe that stories outside the mainstream are mere conspiracies, that ancient knowledge is mere myth, and that nothing exists beyond the polished surface of the officially approved historical narrative. Yet you and I, having journeyed this far together, can sense a deeper truth. There are too many puzzle pieces that do not fit within the story we were taught. Too many traces have been deliberately obscured. Too many warnings have been quietly ignored. And if we do not choose to speak of these stories, they may truly vanish. But history does not die, as long as there are those willing to tell it, those willing to listen, and those willing to question. So when you turn off this video, take a moment to look again at those old maps, those ancient statues, those faded pages you may have once glanced at without a second thought. Perhaps some small symbol, some forgotten mark, might lead you toward a new path of discovery. And when someone tells you that history has only one version, smile. Because after this journey, you now know history is always layered, multidimensional, and alive in hidden currents, waiting for those who truly listen. If you find these kinds of topics worth reflecting on, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read your insights and questions, for it is those very questions that keep this conversation alive. And if you wish to continue exploring these forgotten corners of our past, feel free to subscribe to the channel. There are many more deep, thought-provoking stories still waiting to be told, because history does not die. It waits for someone to bring its light forth once more.
Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most elaborate deceptions. A con game so masterful, so perfectly disguised, that it fooled entire civilizations for over 1,000 years. Picture this. What if I told you that every fairy tale ending you've ever believed in, every romantic royal wedding you've swooned over, was actually part of the greatest scam in human history? What if those beautiful princess gowns were really chains, and those golden crowns were actually price tags? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on medieval royal marriages, and I promise you, what you're about to discover will change how you see every Disney movie forever. Now, before we dive into this royal rabbit hole together, I'd love it if you could hit that like button, but only if tonight's story truly captivates you. And hey, if you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most beautiful lies, that subscribe button is calling your name. I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening to this tucked in bed? Maybe with a cup of tea? Or perhaps you're taking a late night walk under the stars? Drop a comment and let me know where this story finds you tonight. Your stories always make my day. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together and You know, we live in an age where we complain about dating apps. We swipe left, we swipe right, we ghost people after 3 dates. We think modern romance is complicated, don't we? But imagine if your parents could legally sell you to a complete stranger when you were still learning to walk. Imagine if your first kiss was scheduled by a diplomatic committee, and your wedding night was a public spectacle witnessed by dozens of strangers. Welcome to medieval royal marriage, where love was a luxury no one could afford, and every I do was really saying I surrender. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Medieval royal marriages weren't romantic unions. They were business mergers. They weren't about finding your soulmate. They were about expanding your empire. And the bride? She wasn't a princess finding her prince. She was inventory being transferred from one warehouse to another. Let me paint you a picture that'll make your skin crawl. In 1160, a little girl named Margaret was born in Scotland. She was beautiful, they said. Sweet-natured. She probably loved playing with dolls, maybe chasing butterflies in the castle gardens. Normal kid stuff, right? But by the time Margaret turned 3 years old, she was already engaged to be married. Not to another child, mind you. To Henry, the young King of England, who was already a grown man planning military campaigns. 3 years old, and her entire future was sold and sealed with a handshake between 2 men who probably couldn't even pronounce her full name correctly. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. See, here's the thing about medieval royal families. They didn't see their children as children. They saw them as assets. Living, breathing chess pieces in a game of political monopoly that spanned continents. Every royal baby born came with an invisible price tag hanging around their neck. And that price was calculated not in gold, but in strategic value. Think about it. If you're a medieval king, your daughter isn't your little princess who needs bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses. She's your most valuable trading card. She's a potential peace treaty with legs. She's your ticket to claim in someone else's kingdom, or your insurance policy against being invaded yourself. The cold, hard truth. Love was the enemy. Genuine affection between royal spouses was actually dangerous because it meant the couple might start making decisions based on their hearts instead of their kingdom's needs. And that, my friends, was a luxury medieval politics simply couldn't afford. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're 8 years old, playing in your backyard, and suddenly your parents call you inside. "Sweetie," they say, "we've got wonderful news. You're getting married next month to someone you've never met, in a country you can't pronounce, where they speak a language you don't understand. Isn't that exciting?" That was reality for royal children. Except there was no next month. These engagements often happened in infancy, with the actual ceremonies taking place years later, sometimes decades. These kids grew up knowing their entire adult life had already been scripted by strangers, and they had no say in editing the plot. But here's where it gets really twisted. Medieval royal marriages weren't just arranged. They were performed with all the pageantry of a genuine love story. The white dress, the beautiful ceremony, the celebration afterwards. Everyone played along with the romantic fantasy because, well, it made the bitter pill of political manipulation so much easier to swallow. It was theatre. Pure, elaborate theatre designed to make a property transaction look like a fairy tale. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these royal brides and grooms never even met their spouses until their wedding day. Can you imagine? Your first conversation with the person you're legally bound to spend your entire life with happens at the altar, probably in front of hundreds of strangers, while wearing the most uncomfortable outfit you've ever put on. Some couples were luckier. They might exchange a few letters beforehand, maybe a portrait. But even those portraits were basically medieval Photoshop. Court artists were hired to make everyone look like a Renaissance Instagram filter had blessed them from birth. One particularly brutal example, in 1396, 6-year-old Isabella of Valois was married to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. The age gap alone should make your stomach turn. But here's the kicker. This marriage was specifically designed to end a war between England and France. Little Isabella wasn't walking down the aisle to meet her Prince Charming. She was walking down the aisle to seal a ceasefire agreement. She was a living, breathing peace treaty in a pretty dress. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely some of these marriages worked out. Surely some couples found love eventually. And you know what? Some did. But here's the thing. When love did bloom in royal marriages, it was purely accidental. It was a happy side effect, not the goal. And when it did happen, it often caused more problems than it solved. Because personal happiness and political necessity rarely aligned perfectly. The system was designed to fail the individuals within it, while serving the greater political machine. and it worked flawlessly for centuries. But I know what you're wondering right now. If medieval royal marriages were such obvious scams, such blatant examples of treating people like property, why did everyone just go along with it? Why didn't anyone stand up and say, "This is wrong"? Why didn't the children themselves rebel against a system that was stealing their most basic human right, the right to choose who to love? Well, here's where our story gets even more heartbreaking, because the answer reveals something profound about how power works, how control is maintained, and how human beings can be systematically taught to surrender their own dreams. The truth is, these royal children didn't just accept their fate passively. They were actively trained, from the moment they could understand language, to believe that love itself was their enemy, and the methods used to break their spirits. They were more sophisticated and more cruel than anything you could imagine. The answer to those questions is more chilling than you might expect. Because medieval royal families didn't just accidentally stumble into a system that crushed their children's dreams, they perfected it. They turned the destruction of love into an art form, a science, a carefully orchestrated process that began before these children could even speak. Picture this. You're 3 years old, and instead of bedtime stories about brave knights rescuing princesses, you're told tales about princesses who saved kingdoms by marrying wisely. Instead of fairy tales about true love's kiss, you hear legends about queens who brought peace through strategic alliances. Your lullabies aren't about romance. They're about duty, honour, and the greater good. This was the reality for royal children. From their very first words, they were fed a carefully crafted narrative that love was selfish, that personal desires were weakness, and that their highest purpose was to serve as tools of statecraft. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1203 that perfectly illustrates this psychological conditioning when Princess Blanche of Castile was just 9 years old. She was given a wedding doll, a miniature bride figure dressed in the colours of France. But this wasn't a toy. It was a training device. Every day, little Blanche had to practice wedding ceremonies with this doll. She'd rehearse walking down imaginary aisles, saying imaginary vows to imaginary grooms. She'd practice the perfect curtsy, the perfect smile, the perfect expression of grateful submission. She was literally playing house, except the house was a political prison, and she was rehearsing for her own captivity. The genius of this system, and yes, I'm using the word genius in the most twisted way possible, was that it made the children complicit in their own emotional destruction. They weren't just victims. They were trained to be enthusiastic participants in their own sacrifice. But here's where it gets even more sophisticated. Medieval royal courts developed what we might call love substitutes, elaborate rituals and relationships designed to fulfill a child's need for affection while keeping them safely away from anything resembling romantic autonomy. Royal children were surrounded by what they called courtly love, a stylized theatrical form of romance that was all performance and no substance. Young princes would write poems to ladies of the court. Young princesses would receive flowers and songs from noble admirers. It looked like romance. It felt like romance. But it was completely safe because everyone understood it was just a game. It was like giving a hungry person a plastic apple. It satisfies the visual craving without providing any actual nourishment. Princess Eleanor of Brittany wrote in her diary, which survived in a convent archive, about her confusion over these courtly rituals. "Today Sir Geoffrey brought me roses and spoke of my beauty," and she wrote, "but Mother explained that this is not love, merely practice for the real duties that await me. I wonder why we must practice something we are never meant to truly experience." She was 12 when she wrote that. 12 years old, and already grappling with the cognitive dissonance of a system that taught her to perform love while forbidding her to feel it. But you know what's absolutely heartbreaking? Some royal children became so skilled at these emotional performances that they lost track of their own authentic feelings. They became method actors in the tragedy of their own lives, so good at pretending to be content that they sometimes convinced themselves it was real. Take Prince John of England. Yes, the same John who would later become King John of Robin Hood fame. As a child, he was considered a model royal son because he enthusiastically embraced his arranged engagements. He wrote beautiful letters to his intended brides, expressed excitement about his future marriages, and publicly praised the wisdom of his parents' choices. But private letters discovered centuries later in monastery archives tell a different story. John suffered from what we'd now recognise as severe anxiety and depression. He had nightmares about his wedding day, panic attacks during marriage negotiations, and wrote desperate, coded messages to his tutors begging for escape from this golden cage. The boy who appeared to be the perfect, grateful royal son was actually screaming for help in a language no one bothered to learn. And here's what really gets me. The adults around these children genuinely believed they were being kind. They thought they were protecting their sons and daughters from the chaos of emotional choice. Medieval philosophy taught that strong emotions were literally dangerous to one's health and soul. Love, they believed, made people irrational, unpredictable, and therefore unfit to rule. King Louis VII of France wrote in a letter to his brother, "I save my children from the burden of passion, as I would save them from plague or poison. Better they should live in peace without love than die in chaos with it." He wasn't being cruel. He was being what he thought was protective. But what he didn't understand was that by removing love, he wasn't creating peace. He was creating a different kind of chaos. The chaos of living a life that never felt fully real. Now, you might be wondering, didn't any of these children fight back? Didn't anyone refuse to go along with the program? And here's where our story takes a fascinating turn. Because some did rebel. But their rebellions revealed just how deeply the system had infiltrated their psyches. When royal children did resist their arranged marriages, they rarely argued for the right to choose their own partners. Instead, they asked for better arranged marriages, or they begged to enter religious life where marriage could be avoided altogether. They'd been so thoroughly convinced that love was impossible for people like them that they couldn't even imagine it as an option worth fighting for. Princess Constance of Antioch provides a perfect example. In 1130, at age 15, she staged what historians call the most dramatic royal rebellion of the 12th century. She barricaded herself in her chambers, refused to eat, and declared she would never submit to matrimonial slavery. Sounds like a love rebellion, right? But when negotiators finally got her to explain her demands, she wasn't asking for the right to marry for love. She was asking for the right to choose which strategic marriage would best serve her kingdom's interests. She'd been so thoroughly trained to think politically that even her rebellion was framed in terms of statecraft. She literally couldn't conceive of marriage as anything other than a political transaction. The system had succeeded in making her forget that any other kind of union was even possible. But here's what the royal families didn't count on. Human nature is remarkably stubborn. Love, it turns out, is like water. If you try to block it completely, it finds the most unexpected ways to seep through the cracks. And when it does break through in a medieval royal court, the results could be absolutely explosive. Some princes and princesses did fall in love deeply, desperately, dangerously in love. And when that happened, they faced a choice that would define not just their own lives, but the entire course of European history: surrender to the system that had shaped them since birth, or risk everything for the radical act of choosing their own hearts. As we're about to discover, when royal love became rebellion, it didn't just change individual lives. It toppled kingdoms, started wars, and rewrote the very rules of power itself. Because it turns out that love, when it's been suppressed long enough, doesn't just whisper when it finally breaks free, and it roars, And medieval Europe was about to learn just how loud that roar could be. That roar we talked about? It first echoed through the stone halls of Windsor Castle on a cold February morning in 1464, when 18-year-old King Edward IV of England did something so shocking, so absolutely unthinkable, that it sent tremors through every royal court in Europe. He fell in love. Real, genuine, head over heels, can't eat, can't sleep love. And then he did something even more scandalous. He acted on it. Edward was supposed to marry a French princess. The negotiations had been going on for months. Treaties were being drafted. Dowries calculated. But Edward had a problem. He'd met Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with 2 children who was absolutely, completely, politically useless to him. She couldn't bring him a single acre of land, not one military alliance, not even a decent trade agreement. She was just beautiful and kind. And when she laughed at his jokes, he felt something he'd never experienced before, the pure, terrifying joy of being liked for himself, not for his crown. So, what did Edward do? He married her in secret. At dawn, with only her mother and a priest as witnesses. The King of England literally snuck out of his own castle to elope like a lovesick teenager, knowing full well it could cost him his throne. When the news broke, the reaction was swift and absolutely brutal. The French ambassador wrote to his king, "The English have gone mad. Their boy king has confused his kingdom for a romance novel. Parliament seriously considered declaring Edward mentally unfit to rule." His own mother publicly stated she wished she'd never given birth to him. But here's what makes Edward's story so fascinating. He didn't just defend his choice. He celebrated it. At his official wedding announcement, he stood before the entire court and said something that no medieval king had ever dared to say. "I have married for love, and I would rather be a happy commoner than a miserable king." The silence that followed was so complete that courtiers later described it as the sound of an entire worldview cracking. Because Edward had just committed the ultimate royal crime. He'd suggested that personal happiness might be more important than political duty. He'd chosen his heart over his kingdom. And somehow, the kingdom didn't collapse. England didn't fall into chaos. The sun still rose the next morning, and that terrified the other royal families of Europe more than any military threat ever could. But Edward's love rebellion was just the beginning. Once that crack appeared in the system, other royal hearts began to follow the light seeping through. And some of their stories will make you believe in the power of love to literally reshape the world. Take Prince Pedro of Portugal. In 1355, he was arranged to marry Constanza of Castile for obvious political reasons. But Pedro had already fallen desperately in love with Inés de Castro, a Spanish noblewoman who served in Constanza's court. The situation was impossible. Pedro couldn't break his engagement without starting a war. But he also couldn't marry Constanza while his heart belonged to someone else. So he found a third option that nobody saw coming. He married Constanza as planned, but he also secretly married Inés in a clandestine ceremony. He literally committed bigamy for love, creating the most complicated royal love triangle in medieval history. When both marriages were discovered, the political fallout was immediate and devastating. Constanza's family declared war. Pedro's father, King Afonso, ordered Inés to be executed for corrupting the royal bloodline. The Spanish courts called for Pedro to be disinherited, but Pedro's response was so romantic, so utterly devoted, that it's become legend. When he became king after his father's death, his first royal act was to have Inés's body exhumed and crowned as Queen of Portugal. He forced the entire court to kneel and pay homage to her corpse, declaring that death cannot diminish the throne of love. It sounds macabre, but to Pedro, it was the ultimate romantic gesture. He was saying, "I don't care if you think love is weakness. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. This woman was my queen in life, and she'll be my queen in death, and your politics can't change that. The story spread across Europe like wildfire. Suddenly, royal courts everywhere were whispering about the Portuguese king who chose love over sanity, who crowned a corpse rather than deny his heart. Some called him mad, others called him magnificent, but everyone called him memorable. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. Pedro's reign was actually remarkably successful. Portugal prospered under his rule. The economy grew, and the people adored him. It turns out that a king who follows his heart might actually be more effective than one who follows a diplomatic handbook. But perhaps the most spectacular example of royal love rebellion happened in 1410, when Princess Catherine of Valois found herself caught between two impossible choices. She was arranged to marry Henry V of England to seal peace between France and England after decades of war. But Catherine had fallen in love with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier who was so far beneath her station that their marriage would be considered not just inappropriate, but legally treasonous. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Catherine refused to marry Henry, the war between England and France would resume, potentially costing thousands of lives. If she married Henry while loving Owen, she'd be condemning herself to a lifetime of emotional torture. So Catherine did something brilliant. She married Henry V as planned, fulfilled her political duty, gave England an heir, and then, after Henry died, she secretly married Owen Tudor and lived the rest of her life for love. Her strategy was essentially, fine, I'll be your political pawn for a few years, but then I'm taking my life back. And it worked. Her secret marriage to Owen Tudor produced children who would eventually found the Tudor dynasty, meaning that some of England's greatest monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, descended from a love marriage that was supposed to be impossible. Catherine literally changed the course of English history by refusing to let politics permanently crush her heart. But these love rebellions didn't just affect individual lives. They started a revolution in how medieval society thought about marriage, choice, and the relationship between personal happiness and social duty. Because when royal children started choosing love over politics, it sent a message to every other young person in the kingdom. Maybe you don't have to accept the life other people plan for you either. Suddenly, merchant families were allowing their children more say in marriage choices. Noble houses were considering compatibility alongside dowries. The idea that love might be a legitimate factor in life, decisions started spreading through medieval society like a love song. But the established powers didn't give up without a fight. The more royal children rebelled for love, the more elaborate and cruel the system's responses became. And what happened next reveals just how far medieval institutions would go to maintain control over young hearts. Because if you think the training we talked about earlier was intense, wait until you hear about the lengths royal families went to when they realised their children were starting to fight back. The countermeasures they developed were so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating that they make modern propaganda look like amateur hour. And the children caught in this escalating war between love and power, they were about to face choices that no human being should ever have to make. Those impossible choices began to materialise almost immediately after Edward IV's love rebellion sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. The royal establishments across the continent realised that they were facing their worst nightmare. Their carefully constructed system was beginning to crack, and love was seeping through those cracks like water through a dam. Their response was swift, systematic, and absolutely ruthless. Welcome to what I call the medieval dating app from hell. Except this wasn't about finding love. It was about preventing it so thoroughly that royal children would never even dream of Edward IV's rebellion. You see, the old system had a fatal flaw. It allowed royal children to meet potential love interests at court, at ceremonies, during diplomatic visits. Those chance encounters, those stolen glances across a banquet hall, Those conversations during a dance, they were creating exactly the kind of emotional connections that led to disasters like Edward's secret wedding. So the royal families got creative. Terrifyingly creative. In 1470, just 6 years after Edward's scandalous marriage, the French court implemented what they called the Portrait Protocol. From that point forward, royal children weren't allowed to meet their intended spouses until the actual wedding day. Instead, they would be shown painted portraits and given written descriptions of their future partners. But here's where it gets diabolical. These portraits were essentially medieval propaganda pieces designed to make the children fall in love with the political arrangements rather than actual people. Princess Anne of Brittany's experience perfectly illustrates how this system worked. In 1488, when she was 11 years old, she was shown a portrait of Maximilian of Austria, her intended husband. The painting depicted a handsome, noble-looking man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Anne was also given a beautifully written letter, supposedly from Maximilian, expressing his excitement about their future together and his admiration for her intelligence and beauty. Anne spent 3 years writing letters to this portrait, essentially falling in love with a fantasy. She developed elaborate daydreams about their life together, planned their conversations, even practiced what she would say when they finally met. The reality, when Anne finally met Maximilian on her wedding day, she discovered that the portrait had been painted 20 years earlier when he was young and attractive. The real Maximilian was now middle-aged, overweight, and suffering from what medieval physicians called melancholia, basically severe depression. The romantic letters. They'd been written by professional scribes who specialized in creating fake romantic correspondence. Anne had been catfished by the entire medieval political system. But the portrait scam was just the beginning. Royal courts began developing what we might call emotional isolation protocols, designed to prevent their children from forming any meaningful relationships that might compete with arranged marriages. Take the case of Prince Charles of Anjou in 1485. When Charles turned 14, the age when medieval boys typically began forming friendships and romantic interests, his father implemented something called the rotation system. Charles was never allowed to spend more than 2 weeks in the same location. He'd stay at one castle for a fortnight, then be moved to another, then another, then another. The official reason? To broaden the young prince's education and understanding of his future territories. The real reason? To prevent him from forming any lasting emotional bonds with anyone. Every time Charles started to connect with someone, a fellow page, a young lady of the court, even a mentor figure, he'd be whisked away before the relationship could deepen. Charles's private tutor wrote in a letter that survived in monastery archives. The young prince has become like a ghost in his own life, present but never truly settled anywhere. He speaks to no one with real intimacy, trusts no one with his thoughts, and seems to believe that all human connections are temporary by nature. They had successfully trained a prince to be emotionally numb. Mission accomplished. But perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation involved what courts called compatibility theatre. This was the practice of staging elaborate romantic scenarios to make arranged marriages feel like love stories. Here's how it worked. Let's say Princess Isabella was arranged to marry Prince Ferdinand. Months before they met, both children would be told carefully crafted stories about their destined partner. Isabella would hear about Ferdinand's bravery, his kindness, his noble character. Ferdinand would hear about Isabella's beauty, her wit, her gentle nature. Then, when they finally met, the meeting would be orchestrated to feel magical and spontaneous. They'd accidentally encounter each other in a garden. Ferdinand would happen to recite poetry that Isabella had been told was his favourite. Isabella would coincidentally be wearing a colour that Ferdinand had supposedly mentioned loving. Every conversation was scripted. Every spontaneous moment was planned. Every shared interest was artificially manufactured. The children weren't falling in love with each other. They were falling in love with an elaborate theatrical production. The genius of this system was that it gave royal children the feeling of choosing their own partners, while keeping them completely within the bounds of political necessity. They felt like they were experiencing real romance, while actually being manipulated more thoroughly than ever before. Princess Joanna of Castile fell victim to perhaps the most elaborate version of this scam in 1496. She was told that her arranged marriage to Philip of Burgundy had been postponed indefinitely due to political complications. Meanwhile, she began receiving anonymous love letters from a mysterious admirer who seemed to understand her perfectly, who shared her interests in music and poetry, who made her feel seen and valued for who she truly was. Joanna fell deeply in love with her anonymous correspondent. She spent months writing passionate responses, sharing her deepest thoughts and dreams. She felt like she was experiencing the kind of pure spiritual connection that transcended political arrangements. Then, on her wedding day, she discovered that Philip of Burgundy had been her mysterious correspondent all along. The entire romance had been a setup designed to make her political marriage feel like a love story. Joanna's reaction reveals just how psychologically devastating these manipulations could be. Instead of feeling grateful for the elaborate effort to help her love her arranged husband, she felt betrayed and violated. In her diary, she wrote, "They have stolen not just my choice, but my very capacity to trust my own feelings. How can I believe in any emotion when I know it might be another performance designed for political purposes?" She had been so thoroughly manipulated that she could no longer distinguish between authentic feelings and manufactured ones. But you know what's absolutely fascinating? Even these sophisticated psychological manipulations couldn't completely crush the human spirit's need for authentic connection. Some royal children began developing what we might call emotional resistance strategies. They created secret languages, hidden friendships, covert ways of maintaining real human connections despite the system's attempts to isolate them. Some princesses would communicate their true feelings through flower arrangements. A yellow rose meant "I'm lonely." White lilies meant "I'm afraid." Red poppies meant "I remember what real love feels like." Some princes developed elaborate coded correspondence systems, writing letters that looked like formal diplomatic communications but actually contained personal messages hidden in specific word choices and letter spacing. They were essentially running underground emotional railways, smuggling authentic feelings through a system designed to eliminate them entirely. And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because as these medieval dating app manipulations became more sophisticated, they started to backfire in unexpected ways. The royal children who were being most heavily controlled began to develop something the system hadn't anticipated. They became expert at detecting lies, manipulation, and emotional fraud. They had been so thoroughly trained to recognize fake romance that they became incredibly skilled at identifying the real thing when it appeared. And when that happened, when a genuinely authentic connection broke through all the elaborate defenses, well, let's just say that a royal child who spent their entire life surrounded by emotional fakery knows the value of the real thing when they find it, and they're willing to risk everything to protect it. When that real thing finally appeared, it created some of the most legally complex and financially devastating documents in medieval history. Because here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize royal weddings. The paperwork behind these marriages was more complicated than modern corporate mergers, and infinitely more binding. Let me show you just how insane these marriage contracts really were by walking you through one that almost started World War Medieval. In 1469, the marriage contract between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon wasn't just a wedding agreement. It was a 47-page legal document that essentially redesigned the map of Spain. And when I say 47 pages, I'm talking about dense, handwritten medieval script that would make modern tax law look like a children's book. Page 1 covered the basics. Who was marrying whom, when, and where. Pages 2 through 15 dealt with the dowry, but this wasn't just "here's some golden land." Isabella's dowry included entire cities, trading routes, mining rights, fishing territories, and something called future conquest rights, which basically meant Ferdinand would own half of any land Isabella might conquer later in life. Talk about ambitious wedding planning. But pages 16 through 31, that's where things got really wild. These pages covered what we might call genetic futures trading, detailed specifications about which children would inherit what, how many sons needed to be produced to secure the alliance, what would happen if Isabella died in childbirth, what would happen if Ferdinand died in battle, and even contingency plans for what would happen if both of them died but left pregnant mistresses. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval marriage contracts included provisions for hypothetical children from extramarital affairs. They were planning for infidelity before the couple had even said, "I do." Pages 32 through 40 covered military obligations. When Isabella married Ferdinand, she wasn't just gaining a husband, she was contractually obligating her entire kingdom to provide military support for any wars Ferdinand might start for the rest of his life. Ferdinand, in turn, was legally bound to defend Isabella's territories, even if it meant bankrupting his own kingdom. Imagine signing a marriage certificate that automatically enrolled your entire family in your spouse's future fights. "Honey, I love you so much I'm willing to commit my father's army to whatever conflicts you might stumble into over the next 40 years. And the final 15 pages? Those dealt with what medieval lawyers called dissolution impossibilities, essentially an encyclopedia of reasons why this marriage could never ever be undone, no matter what happened. Adultery, incompatibility, religious differences, political disagreements. Even if one spouse tried to assassinate the other, none of it mattered. The contract was more permanent than death itself. But here's what makes Isabella and Ferdinand's contract absolutely fascinating. It was considered relatively simple by medieval standards. Let me tell you about the marriage contract that nearly broke the medieval legal system entirely. In 1453, Margaret of Anjou's marriage to Henry VI of England required a team of 12 lawyers working for 8 months just to draft the agreement. The final contract was 89 pages long and included provisions so complex that they're still being debated by legal historians today. Margaret's dowry wasn't just property, it included what the contract called theoretical territories, meaning land that didn't exist yet but might be conquered in the future. Henry VI was essentially agreeing to marry Margaret in exchange for the possibility that maybe someday her family might win some wars and give him the hypothetical spoils. It was like getting married for Bitcoin when Bitcoin was still just a sketch on someone's napkin. But the truly insane part was the emotional performance clauses. Margaret's contract legally required her to appear happy in public, to speak positively about Henry in all correspondence, and to demonstrate marital affection in accordance with royal dignity at all public functions. They literally wrote mandatory happiness into the marriage contract. Margaret could be miserable in private, but her public joy was a legal obligation with specific financial penalties for non-compliance. The contract specified that if Margaret appeared melancholy, sullen, or insufficiently enthusiastic at public events more than 3 times per year, Henry's family could demand financial compensation from her dowry. They essentially put a price tag on fake smiles. Imagine having your emotional performance monitored by lawyers and accountants. "Sorry, Your Majesty, but you've exceeded your annual sadness quota. That'll be 500 gold pieces and a written apology to the kingdom." Now, you might be thinking these contracts were just extreme examples from particularly dysfunctional royal families. But the truth is, every single royal marriage in medieval Europe involved similarly complex negotiations. The difference was just how openly they acknowledged the business nature of the transaction. Some families tried to maintain romantic pretenses by burying the brutal, contractual details in flowery language. Princess Anne of Bohemia's 1382 marriage contract to Richard II of England described her dowry as tokens of familial affection and hopes for future happiness. But when you read the fine print, those tokens included 15 castles, 6 entire towns, exclusive mining rights to 3 silver deposits, and legal ownership of any children she might have with anyone other than Richard. They were essentially saying, here's a romantic gift of massive territorial control and reproductive ownership rights. Isn't love beautiful? Other families went the opposite direction and treated marriage contracts like military treaties. The 1385 marriage agreement between John of Gaunt and Constance of Castile read more like a war plan than a wedding announcement. The couple's emotional relationship was mentioned exactly once, in a single sentence that basically said, the parties agree to maintain cordial personal relations sufficient to produce male heirs. Everything else was about troop movements, taxation rights, and strategic positioning for future conflicts. John wasn't marrying Constance. He was entering into a military alliance that happened to include periodic reproductive obligations. But here's what's absolutely mind-bending about these contracts. They often included clauses that would seem insane even by modern business standards. Some marriage agreements had provisions for performance reviews where the couple's relationship would be evaluated annually by a panel of advisors to ensure they were fulfilling their contractual obligations. Others included upgrade clauses where one spouse could renegotiate the terms of the marriage if their family's political position improved significantly. Imagine having to get your in-laws' permission before getting a promotion because it might affect your marriage contracts. And my personal favourite, some contracts included compatibility guarantees, where families could demand partial refunds of dowries if the married couple turned out to be temperamentally unsuited for productive collaboration. They literally had return policies on marriages. Sorry, these personalities don't mesh well. Can we get store credit toward a different spouse? The complexity of these contracts created an entire industry of medieval marriage lawyers who specialised in nothing but royal wedding negotiations. Some of these lawyers spent decades working on single contracts, becoming experts in the most minute details of territorial law, inheritance customs, and diplomatic protocol. There's a surviving letter from one such lawyer, Master Guillaume de Nogent, where he complains to a colleague, I have spent 3 years negotiating the precise definition of marital affection for the Burgundy alliance. We are currently deadlocked over whether hand-holding in public should be classified as mandatory courtesy or optional romantic display. 3 years. Arguing about hand-holding clauses for one wedding. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these contracts was how they handled the possibility of love developing between the spouses. Most agreements included specific provisions about what would happen if the couple actually started to care about each other. Some contracts prohibited emotional attachment entirely, treating love as a breach of contract that could void the entire arrangement. Others allowed for controlled affection, but specified that romantic feelings could never supersede political obligations. And a few particularly paranoid families included love detection protocols, where the couple would be monitored for signs of genuine attachment that might interfere with their strategic decision-making. They were so afraid of love that they hired people to watch for it and eliminate it if it appeared. Medieval marriage contracts didn't just ignore love, they actively worked to prevent it. But here's what all these elaborate legal machinations couldn't account for: human creativity in the face of impossible restrictions. Because when you make love illegal, people don't stop loving, they just get more creative about how they express it. And the creative solutions some royal couples developed to maintain authentic connection within these contractual prisons, they were so ingenious, so romantic, and so dangerous that they threatened to bring down the entire system from the inside. Now, I need to tell you about one of the most bizarre and frankly disturbing practices in medieval royal marriage history. Something so strange that when I first read about it in historical archives, I thought it had to be a joke. But it wasn't. This was completely real, completely legal, and completely insane. Welcome to the world of proxy weddings, where royal marriages were so political that the bride and groom didn't even need to be in the same country, or sometimes even the same continent, to get married. Picture this. You're a medieval princess, maybe 14 years old, standing in a beautiful cathedral wearing your finest gown. There's music, flowers, hundreds of witnesses, all the pageantry of a royal wedding. You walk down the aisle, you say your vows, you even exchange rings with your new husband, except your husband isn't there. Instead, you're marrying his representative, usually some random duke or ambassador who's literally standing in for the actual groom. You're promising to love, honour, and obey a man you've never met, represented by a stranger who might not even know your husband's first name. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was standard operating procedure for medieval royal marriages. In fact, proxy weddings were so common that the Catholic Church had to develop specific rules about how to make them legally binding. Let me tell you about the most absolutely ridiculous proxy wedding in medieval history. In 1396, 6-year-old Princess Isabella of Valois was married to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. But here's the kicker. Richard was busy fighting a war in Ireland and couldn't make it to the ceremony. So who stood in for the King of England at his own wedding? The Earl of Nottingham, a man who had never met Richard personally and had been chosen for the job literally because he was the right height to make the ceremony look visually appropriate. Isabella, who was 6 years old, stood next to this complete stranger and promised to be a faithful wife to a man she wouldn't meet for another 3 years. The Earl of Nottingham, wearing Richard's colours, slipped a ring onto this child's finger and kissed her cheek to seal the deal. And here's the most insane part. This marriage was considered completely legal and binding. Isabella was officially the Queen of England based on a ceremony where the groom was represented by someone who was essentially a well-dressed stranger hired for the day. It was like getting married through a temp agency. But proxy weddings could get even weirder. Some ceremonies involved what medieval law called symbolic consummation, a ritual designed to make the marriage legally complete even though the actual husband was hundreds of miles away. In 1420, Princess Catherine of Valois was married by proxy to King Henry V of England. During the ceremony, Catherine was required to lie on a bed while the proxy groom, the Duke of Bedford, placed his leg on top of the covers next to her. This bizarre ritual was supposed to symbolically represent the marriage being consummated, making it legally unbreakable under church law. Imagine explaining that to your therapist. Well, I married a king I'd never met, represented by his brother, who put his leg on my bed while 3 bishops watched and took notes. The whole thing was so surreal that Catherine later wrote in her diary, "Today I became wife to a stranger through the leg of another stranger while surrounded by men in robes who assured me this made perfect sense according to God's law." But here's where proxy weddings reveal something truly dark about medieval royal marriages. They made it crystal clear that the bride's consent was completely irrelevant. These ceremonies could happen without any input from the people actually getting married. Princess Joan of Navarre discovered this in the most traumatic way possible in 1419. She woke up one morning to discover that she'd been married by proxy the night before without her knowledge. Her father had arranged the ceremony, chosen a proxy, and completed the entire wedding while Joan slept in the next room. When she was informed that she was now officially married to Duke John of Brittany, Joan asked the logical question, "Can I meet my husband before I have to start living with him?" The answer was no. Joan was told that meeting her husband before joining him in Brittany would be inappropriate, since she was now a married woman and needed to maintain proper dignity. So Joan was shipped off to Brittany to begin married life with a man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard, whose personality was a complete mystery to her. Her first conversation with her husband happened when she arrived at his castle and introduced herself as his wife. "Hello, I'm Joan, your wife. Apparently we got married last week. Surprise! But perhaps the most elaborate proxy wedding scam involved Princess Margaret of Scotland in 1469. Margaret was arranged to marry Charles the Bold of Burgundy, but Charles was notorious for being, well, completely insane. His own family was embarrassed by his erratic behaviour, and several previous marriage negotiations had fallen through when potential brides' families discovered just how unstable